All right, students, welcome. So last class we did a little introduction lesson on what is the Bible and how do we use the Bible as Catholics. Now we're going to delve deeper into the content of the Bible. Now this lesson, together with what is in your textbook that you have access on through the Sadlier site, should do well enough to help you understand the concept. So today we're going to be talking about the story of creation. Now, the story of creation is found and is rather spread across Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So we're going to take a look at that and we're going to familiarize ourselves with both the narrative and with the function of the narrative within the understanding of what it is to be Catholic. So let's talk a little more about this. So one of the first things that's important to understand about the story of Genesis is we really have a couple of creation accounts in Genesis. Chapter 1 of Genesis gives us one rendition on the creation process, and chapter 2 gives us a slightly different description, a slightly different timeline in terms of the events. So let's take a little further look. So if I were to ask most people how many creation stories there are in the Bible, most people are going to tell me one. It's the one we find in Genesis. And it's very convenient because most time we talk about Genesis as one story, as one event. But that's really not actually correct. As I've said before, it is two. There are actually two separate accounts of creation. One given in Genesis chapter 1 and the other given in Genesis chapter 2. And when we look at them, we get a slightly different rendition, a slightly different version of events. So let's talk a little bit about these two different versions of Genesis. All right, so let's take a look at this for a second. So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 1. Now, in case any of you want to follow along, I'm using a New American Bible. This is your standard Catholic Bible, or you can use whatever you happen to have at home. Generally, while a Catholic Bible is the most ideal for something like this, since it's translated directly by the magisterium, and it's not particularly, it's pretty easy to read. It's translated into modern English and is based directly off of the Greek and Hebrew translations. That doesn't mean that you are, if that's not something you have readily available at home in a pinch, a Protestant Bible will work just fine. Like an Oxford Study Bible or something like that's going to work just fine. Honestly, for Old Testament stuff, if you're really in a bind, even a Jewish Tanakh or Torah would probably work in a pinch. You're probably only going to have a few words or phrases that are going to be a little off from the magisterium version. So again, better to have a Catholic Bible, but if you don't happen to have one of those around the house, just follow along in whatever you have readily available. So I'm going to read you the first creation account. This is Genesis chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. So, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless wasteland, and darkness covered the abyss, while a mighty wind swept over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw how good the light was. God then separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Thus evening came, and morning followed, the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a dome in the middle of the waters to separate one body of water from the other." And so it happened. God made the dome, and it separated the waters above the dome from the waters below it. God called the dome the sky. Evening came, and morning followed, the second day. Then God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into a single basin, so the dry land may appear. And so it happened. The water under the sky was gathered into its basin, and the dry land appeared. God called the dry land the earth. And the basin of the water he called the sea. God saw how good it was. Then God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation, every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit, with its seed in it. And so it happened. The earth brought forth every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit with its seed in it. God saw how good it was. Evening came, and morning followed, the third day. Then God said, let there be light in the dome of the sky to separate day from night. Let them mark the fixed times, the days, and the years, to serve as luminaries in the dome of the sky, to shed light upon the earth. And so it happened. God made the two great lights, the greater one to govern the day, and the lesser one to govern the night. And he made the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to shed light upon the earth, to govern the day and night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw how good it was. Evening came, and morning followed, the fourth day. Then God said, let the water teem with an abundance of living creatures, and on the earth let birds fly beneath the dome of the sky. So it happened. God created the great sea monsters and all kinds of swimming creatures, with which the waters teem, and all kinds of winged birds. God saw how good it was. Then God blessed them, saying, be fertile, multiply, and fill the water of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. Evening came, and morning followed, the fifth day. Then God said, let the earth bring forth all kinds of living creatures, cattle, creeping things, and wild animals of all kinds. And so it happened. God made all kinds of wild animals, all kinds of cattle, and all kinds of creeping things of the earth. God saw how good it was. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, and over all the wild animals and all the creatures that crawl on the ground. God created man in his image. In the divine image he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, saying, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that move on the earth. God also said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant all over the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit on it to be your food. And to all the animals of the land, all the birds of the air, and all the living creatures that crawl on the ground, I give all the green plants for food. So it happened. God looked at everything he had made and found it very good. Evening came and morning followed, the sixth day. Now, a bit of a misnomer. We usually like to refer to the first account as chapter 1, but it extends a little bit into chapter 2, namely chapter 2 up into the first half of the fourth verse. I know it's a little confusing, but just bear with me. Thus the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed. Since on the seventh day God was finished with the work he had been doing, he rested on the seventh day from all the work he had undertaken. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work he had done in creation. Such is the story of the heavens and the earth at their creation. All right, so let's take a look at that for a second. So that is one account. We have one story, right, of creation, a process that takes about 6 days with the seventh day of rest. And this is how the ancient Israelites, the ancient Hebrew people, actually came up with the idea of a 7-day week, is based upon this idea of a story of God creating the earth in 6 days. And on the seventh, there being a rest, a Sabbath. Now, before we get any deeper into that, let's take a step back. Or at the very least, I should say this story is very intimately tied to the process by which the week came to be in ancient Israelite culture. Now let's take a look at the story a little deeper. Now, that second story of creation, let's take a look at that, because you're going to notice it's a little different. At the time when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, while as yet there was no field shrub on earth, and no grass of the field had sprouted. For the Lord God had sent no rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the soil. But a stream was welling up out of the earth, and was watering all the surface of the ground. The Lord God formed man out of the clay of the ground, and blew into his nostrils the breath of life. And so man became a living being. Then the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he placed there the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made various trees grow that were delightful to look at and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. A river rises in Eden to water the garden. Beyond there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that winds through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is excellent. Bdellium and lapis lazuli are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that winds through all of the land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It is the one that flows east of Asher. The fourth river, the Euphrates. The Lord God then took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. The Lord God gave man this order: you are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden, except the tree of knowledge of good and bad. From that tree you shall not eat. The moment you eat from it, you are surely doomed to die. The Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a suitable partner for him. So the Lord God formed out of the ground various wild animals and various birds of the air, and he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called each of them would be its name. The man gave names to all the cattle, all the birds of the air, and all the wild animals, but none proved to be a suitable partner for the man. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep on the man, and while he was asleep, he took out one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. The Lord God then built up into a woman the rib that he had taken from the man. When he brought her to the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of her man this one has been taken. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body. The man and his wife were both naked, yet they felt no shame. So you're probably looking at this and noticing that there's a few interesting things that separate these accounts, right? Genesis chapter 1, we have this image of the earth being created. In chapter 2, we have the story of man naming all the animals. And you notice they're very different. So you probably have some questions. Why are there two contradicting stories? For example, in Genesis chapter 1's account of creation, the earth is covered entirely in water. And it doesn't become, and dry land does not emerge until God specifically separates the land from the water. Whereas in Genesis chapter 2, the earth starts off as a dry place, with the exception of a well bubbling up. Additionally, the order is off between the two accounts. In Genesis chapter 1, God first creates the things in the sea and on the air, then the animals on the land, and then humanity at the tail end of it. Whereas in Genesis chapter 2's version of creation, God creates one man, one male, one dude, if you will, and then proceeds to create everything else, all the other critters of the world, and only after that, and has man go through naming them all, and then only after that creates a woman. A few of you may also have the question you're itching to ask, but don't think you're allowed to ask here, which is, why no mention of the dinosaurs, or evolution, or millions of years, or anything else you tend to get in a science class? What are you to make of this? Relax. A lot of people think, oh, this is the point where Mr. Skanga is going to tell us to disregard everything our science teacher told us. Relax. You're perfectly free to believe whatever your science teacher is teaching you. Relax. It's not, no, we're not going to go into that. So the first thing we got to understand here is, while there are the Bible, when we talk about the actual books of the Bible, not only is the Bible total of over 70 individual books, not all of these books have a single author. In fact, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, this is what, as Christians, we call it the Pentateuch, which means the 5 books, meaning because they are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Our Jewish friends have an alternative, although frankly equally unimaginative, name for these 5 books. They call them the Torah, which in Hebrew simply means the law, since these are the only 5 books of the Bible to explicitly talk about divine law. So again, the names are excellently descriptive, if not particularly unimaginative. There's 5 of them, the first 5 books, Pentateuch. They're the only ones to discuss law, Torah. Okay, so what do we know about these first 5 books of the Bible? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Well, we know they were written by 4 separate authors. In fact, as best as we can tell, they may well have started out as 4 separate works, as 4 separate books that were then mashed up together to form 5 new books. Yes. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, one wrote Genesis, one wrote Exodus, one wrote a piece of Genesis, another wrote a piece of Genesis, and another wrote a piece of Exodus, and yet another one wrote a piece of Exodus. It's not, that's how it works. Now, who are these guys? The actual truth is, we don't know that either. We don't know the names of these original authors. We recognize them based on their style of writing and their subject matter. So who are they? We as scholars, we as modern historians have given these authors titles. We've given them names, but we don't know what their given names were. So who are these people? The first is what's called the Yahwist author. This is a work that biblical historians sometimes call the Book of J. Why do we call this person this? Well, the author, the Yahwist author, comes from the fact that this author refers to God by this Hebrew Yud He Vav He, these 4 letters, which roughly translate out as YHVH. How is this? This is what's sometimes called the Tetragrammaton, the 4-character title, the sort of name of God. This is the title of God, the name of God, at least. And this, now, how is this word pronounced? Minor side note, we don't actually know how this word is pronounced. And the reason for this is that at some point long before the establishment of Christianity, back during, at some point during the period of Second Temple Judaism, it was decided that this name was so holy that it was only to be said once a year in the temple sanctuary. So while it was written down, there were no, it was never pronounced very often by most of the population. And since the ancient Hebrew alphabet only has consonants, they only have characters for consonants. Modern Hebrew has a series of dots and dashes underneath and in between the consonants that we use to represent vowels. But that doesn't exist in ancient Hebrew. So we don't know what vowels fit between this YH and this VH. So we don't actually know how it may have been pronounced. To make it all the harder, there are certain letters in here that can be pronounced in very different ways. So suffice it to say, we don't know how this word is pronounced, but we know that this title of God, this sacred title of God, is what the Yahwist author used to refer to God as. So for example, the Yahwist author is usually credited with, for example, Genesis chapter 2 is usually ascribed to the Yahwist author. So in that line in Genesis chapter 2, where it says in the second account of creation, where you get that famous line of, read it out to you, where it says, at the time when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, instead of writing God or Lord God, you would see in the Hebrew text the Yud He Vav He. That's what lets modern historians know, okay, we're talking about this author. Now, the other author we have is the Elohist author. We know of this individual because this individual used an entirely different title for God, Elohim, which means God as in God, the one and only. We also have the Deuteronomist author, which basically wrote most of Deuteronomy and very little else. And the priestly author, which is generally considered to be the last of these authors to have been writing, and is generally credited with not only being the last of these authors to write, but also the editor. And it's widely known that this account of creation, along with most of the Pentateuch, came into its present form, or close enough to its present form, the Hebrew version of its present form, from which the church fathers simply translated, during the Babylonian exile. And this is the gentleman who's not only responsible for writing down several of the passages of the Bible, but also for editing the book of J, the book of E, and the book of Deuteronomy together into their present forms as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So what's up with the Babylonian exile? So why does this story come about? So during this period, the ancient Israelites, the ancient Jewish people, were forcibly removed. This is around the 6th century BCE. So, or BC, either one. I use BCE in this context. It's the one most of you are more familiar with from school, but same difference. And were forcibly relocated to Babylon in what's now modern day Iraq. So they're moved from what's now modern day Israel to modern day Iraq. And this move was not particularly easy on the ancient Israelites. They faced a great deal of racism when they arrived, a great deal of prejudice at the hands of the people who came to rule over them. And there was a pressure. See, nowadays, when we think about religion, we tend to think of the big question being, do you believe in a God or do you believe in no God? Right? That's the way it's phrased for most people. But in the ancient world, that really wasn't it. Atheism was not particularly popular in the ancient world. Most people in the ancient world believed in the idea of a God. The issue that kept the Israelites and the ancient Hebrew people, and later on our Christian ancestors, separate from the rest of their neighbors, was the question of how many gods. Whereas we said one, they believed in multitudes. And there was a great deal of pressure, right? The Israelites found themselves as strangers in a strange land where everyone around them worshiped multiple gods and goddesses. And there was a great deal of pressure to acquiesce to the culture, to give in to the culture and the religion of their Babylonian overlords. And it's in this environment that the Pentateuch comes to be written. And it's written as a way to try to carry on the traditions of the Jewish people, our ancestors in faith, and also a way of convincing them to hold fast to the belief in a single God. And to really understand why contrast exists in these stories, especially Genesis chapter 1, the first creation account, it's very important to take a look at the Babylonian version. Now, every culture, as I said before, remember, this is all atheism is not popular in the ancient world. There's no theory of evolution, no Big Bang, none of that. So the Babylonians also had their own beliefs about creation. And the way these came about was in their own account, the Enlil Enlish, which I know I'm butchering because I cannot pronounce ancient, I can't speak ancient Babylonian or ancient Sumerian to save my life. But this was the exact opposite. This was a story that was chaotic. It was violent. It involved, the conflicts between gods and monsters and murder and treachery and all this nastiness. And the account of Genesis, particularly Genesis chapter 1, that very orderly, day 1, God does this, sees it good, it's good. Okay, day 2, God does this, sees it's good, moves on, is meant to act as a contrast. It's meant to be the polar opposite of this chaotic pagan version of creation that we see in the Enlil and Lish. So Genesis is orderly, whereas the Enlil and Lish is chaotic. Genesis places a great emphasis on one God, right? Making all the decisions, calling all the shots, right? If we look at Genesis chapter 1, every step of the way, we have God making a decision, looking at what he's done, says, okay, it's good, doing something else. Whereas, so there's a plan, and it's one God calling all the shots, as opposed to the Anu Elish, where you had multiple gods, goddesses, and godlike monsters who were all had competing agendas and aims, with the cosmos in its present form being sort of a happy accident. Now, the other major difference we get is the reason for humanity. In Genesis, we get this line, right? We get and I'm going to take you right to the page where it says it. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, we get this. God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This idea that humanity is created in the divine image. That's the reason for humanity's creation, which contrasts very differently from most pagan societies. The Babylonians, like most of their pagan neighbors, their polytheistic neighbors, believed that humanity existed to serve the gods through sacrifices, that their gods needed humanity to provide sustenance to them. And ultimately what we get is whereas there's no implication of that in Genesis. There's no idea that God as the creator requires his creation to do anything to sustain him. God is all-powerful. So he didn't need his creation. He did it simply because, so to speak. I'm probably explaining it very poorly, but that's the best way to explain it. So let's talk about it. So in Genesis, at the end of the day, what you get is a universe governed by one God who's sovereign, controls everything, and is benevolent, is good-natured, is simply looking after what's best for his creation. Whereas this is a stark contrast to the rather chaotic world of the Israelites' pagan neighbors, who believed they were governed by multiple deities, multiple gods with competing interests. So now let's take a look at this line again. Let's come back to this line. God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So what conclusions should we as Catholics draw from this line? Because this line holds a major significance. Because a lot of people might be saying, okay, I get where that whole orderly creation account is important to our ancient ancestors, right? Is important to our Israelite, forefathers in faith who are strangers in a strange land trying to keep their religious zeal up. But what's the takeaway for modern Catholics who aren't dealing with the pressure to join a pagan Babylonian culture? Why is this story still important? What's in Genesis chapter 1? Why do we still care about it? Is there still anything in there for us? And the answer is yes, there is. So, and this is the biggest point, and it's a point that a lot of people often miss, is this idea of humanity in the divine image, right? Now, it says, God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So this implies that all humanity, regardless of race, regardless of, gender, religion, whatever, are made in the image of God. And as a being made in the image of God, this instills them with a certain amount of human dignity and human worth. And it's for this reason that the Catholic Church abhors any form of discrimination, such as racism or sexism or the like, because it would be to mistreat something which is made in the image of God. So that is the importance of, that's why we still focus on Genesis chapter 1. It's not to push a literalist narrative. You're free to endorse or not endorse a literalist interpretation of Genesis if you want. The College of Cardinals, it leaves that up to you. They don't particularly say you have to believe in creationism. They don't particularly say you're forbidden from it. That's your call. However, the part that's not up for negotiation is the rule that humanity is created ultimately in the image of God, and that instills every human being with an inherent amount of self-worth. And it's for this reason that the church abhors all forms of discrimination against people, including racism, sexism, and the like. So that's the moral takeaway. That's why this account is so important to us as Catholic Christians. So let's take a look at some more in Genesis, because Genesis isn't quite done yet. So next thing we're going to take a quick look at is Adam to deluge. Some of the stories we find in Genesis ranging from the time of Adam to the time of the flood. And a lot of these are Bible stories that you're relatively familiar with, so I'm not going to spend an eternity on them. We're going to kind of review them, and we're going to move on. So, Adam and Eve. This the account of the humanity's fall from grace is found largely in Genesis chapter 3. And Genesis chapter 3 deals with the origin of original sin. And it details how Adam and Eve are living in the Garden of Eden, this paradise. And at some point, they are approached by a serpent who's generally interpreted as being the devil. And the devil tempts Eve, and he kind of begins the questioning in a rather roundabout way. He says to Eve, "Is it true that you're not allowed to eat from any of the fruit in the garden?" And Eve says, No. It's just the fruit of that particular tree, the tree of knowledge of good and bad, or tree of knowledge of good and evil. Good and bad is the translation the cardinals use, and that's what we're going to use here. But you may occasionally see it referred to as good and evil. Potato, it's the same tree. So the snake says, "Oh no." So basically, so she turns to the snake and says, No, it's just that particular tree. Snake says, "Well, what did God say would happen if you ate from the tree?" Eve says, "Well, he said we'd surely die." And snake says, No. You're not going to die. If you eat from that tree, you're going to become godlike. You're going to see the world as it really is and do it. Well, that's about all the sales pitch it took for Eve to decide this sounds like a great idea. So she picks some of the fruit off the tree, and then she hands some to her husband. They eat the fruit, and suddenly, poof, their eyes are opened, and they realize, well, not opened literally, but figuratively, they suddenly realize, oh, we're naked. That's not okay. So suddenly, they rush to cover themselves up. When God comes into God then appears before them in the garden, and they're ashamed because they're naked, so they hide. When God asks why they hid from him, Adam says, well, we were naked. God asks, hey, who told you you were naked? Adam doesn't have an answer for that, to which he then says, oh, so you have eaten from the literally one tree I told you not to eat from. So what is this forbidden fruit? Now, one last thing. After this, Adam and Eve are kicked out of paradise. And it's at this point that it's described as the doors of paradise are sealed. The gates of heaven are closed, and humanity will not get to re-enter it until after the coming of Jesus. Now, fun fact. One of the things that's very interesting about the account of this Bible story is it makes clear something very interesting about humans. It separates us from the rest of divine creation, and that is moral culpability. Right? We as humans are in a unique position because we are what are called moral agents. This means that we are capable of making both morally good decisions and morally bad decisions and being judged accordingly. This is a unique prerogative only to human beings, right? Animals may commit brutal acts against each other, but they don't really have a sense of moral judgment, right? And that's something that's unique to humans. It's a unique space for humans in divine creation, is our moral culpability. We understand morality, and as a result are also accountable for what we do, if that makes any sense. So what's up with the forbidden fruit? A lot of historians have spent a lot of time questioning what is this fruit, or what fruit is the sacred author talking about, at least, right? Even if you don't regard the story as literally true, what fruit are they even talking about? Because the fruit is never named. Now, there are a few theories. The apple is usually the most popular candidate. In fact, a lot of you, if you've read children's Bibles, or you may well even had a previous religion teacher that told you outright it was an apple. That's not so clear. So why do we often associate it with an apple? Why is it even painted as an apple? There's a few competing theories. Theory one, that the word male, meaning apple, and malum, meaning bad, are very similar words. So this mal and malum, male, kind of similarity in Latin is what, and it's the fruit of good and bad. This is what led a lot of people to start thinking, well, then it's got to be an apple. Alternatively, most of as we know, there were no cameras around back in, antiquity. So most paintings we have of these are artists' depictions of Eden, made, even millennia after the time of Jesus, let alone the time Genesis. So if we're looking at the account of what this is, if we're looking at the pictures of it, we're looking at an artist's rendering. And most artists in the Renaissance, which is when most of these pictures were painted, would have simply said to themselves, well, what fruit look like they belong in a garden? Right? So they looked around at the gardens of their own day and tried to use those as a model to draw the foliage of paradise. And apparently they thought very highly of the apple because apples featured everywhere in these paintings. However, there's a good deal of evidence that suggests it might not be intended to be an apple, because apples were not common to the region where the biblical books were written. Most of the biblical books were written either in Israel or in Babylon, in modern-day Iraq. And apples really weren't native to either region during those centuries. So it seems very unlikely that an account featuring an apple would have been written. So what might it be? Well, some have suggested the pomegranate. Why? Well, pomegranates were native to the region, and pomegranates already had an unsavory reputation in a lot of culture. For example, their Greek neighbors described the pomegranate as the fruit of the underworld. So is it possible the pomegranate already kind of having a seedy reputation? And no, I did not intend seedy as a pomegranate pun, but it works. Is it maybe the pomegranate that was intended? Or lastly, it's possible this is meant to just be an entirely separate fruit that doesn't exist in the wider world. It's a particular fruit associated with a very particular limited supply tree. The Bible only mentions one tree of knowledge. So if there's only one of it, would probably produce some unique fruit, unique to itself, and not in common with any existing fruit tree. All right, let's talk about Cain and Abel. So in Genesis chapter 4, we get some more details. And the details we get are that Adam and Eve have some kids. And they have two sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain becomes the first farmer and Abel the first shepherd. And Cain and Abel, however, grow up outside Eden. And while their parents do inform them of the existence of God, they've never personally walked with God in the Garden of Eden. They're not as close with God as their parents, to put it another way. And they start to, and what happens is one day they go to make sacrifices. They go to make an offering to God to show thanks. And God looks favorably on the sacrifice of Abel, the shepherd, but not on that of Cain, the farmer. And Cain becomes jealous of his brother Abel. So one day he takes a rock and he bashes his brother's head in repeatedly with the rock, like so. And when this happens, God ends up kicking Cain out, says, you got to go off across the desert. And this is described as the first murder in the Bible. So humanity's out of paradise for about one generation. We've already discovered murder. It's not looking great for us. And finally, we arrive at the story of Noah and the deluge, the flood. So God grows greatly dissatisfied with humanity. Humanity starts sinning all over the place, right? We are murdering, we're fighting, we're violent. And God decides, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, creation just isn't working out as well as I'd like it to. So let's purge the world. Let's get rid of most of the place. But God likes this one particular family under the guidance of Noah. And he tells Noah, hey, I want you to build an ark. I want you to build a box. Now, when we picture an ark, we picture this large boat. That's not necessarily it. God says, I want you to build a box, just a big wooden box. And I want you to put 2 of each living creature into the box. This story probably isn't best understood literally. And Noah does, and Noah and his family survive the flood. And it's through this process that God rescues his own and resets the planet. At the end of this flood, which lasts well over 40 days and 40 nights, God decides to make a covenant with all of mankind, an agreement. And God says, I will never again destroy the world with a flood. And to signify this covenant, it says he placed his bow in the heavens. And so from that time until the present, the rainbow has been regarded as a symbol of the covenant between God and all of humanity. This agreement not to destroy the world again is seen as binding not only on those who, on the ancient Jewish people or the modern Christian people, but on all of humanity. All right, cool. So finally tonight, and this will be our last slideshow of the night, we're going to look at the first half of our discussion on the patriarchs. So let's talk about them a little bit. Who are the patriarchs? So let's talk a little about life after the flood. So we know that Noah has a set of sons. Now, Noah has a set of sons. And the Bible mentions this lengthy genealogy. So I'm gonna give you a quick, and basically he has 3 sons: Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And it lists this idea of this one begot this one begot that one, this one had this kid, this one had that kid. And you're like, okay, who cares about all these dead people? But the truth is, this list, while it may sound like a list of unpronounceable names, there's actually great significance to it, because the list actually represents the language groups. So, for example, Japheth, the people descended from Japheth. These are not the names of individual people, but the names of entire cultures, right? So, most likely, this represents the ancient Hebrews' understanding that certain groups of people are linked by language. So, for example, Japheth has Gomer, representing the Sumerians, and they mention 3 children of Gomer. Ashkenaz, the Scythians, which is roughly modern day like Ukraine. Riphath and Tagma, Magog has his kids, Mediah, the Medes, Javan, the Greeks, of which they indicate 3 types, Elisha, aka the people of Cyprus, the Kittim, the certain inhabitants of Cyprus, and the Rodanim, which are the inhabitants of Rhodes. Ham, on the other hand, the Hamitic languages. And they mention Cush, aka Nubia or Ethiopia, Sheba, Havilah, Sabbath, Rama. These are all places. These are all groups of people that you would find in that part of the world, near the Horn of Africa. Not the tip of Africa, but the Horn, over near modern-day Ethiopia. Sheba, Dedan, Sabta, Nimrod is the only exception to this. Nimrod is most likely a proper name. Mizraim, meaning Egypt, and then they mention various peoples. The Ludim, the Anamim, the Pathrusium, the Upper Egyptians, and they also mention the Caphrotim. And this is rather interesting because it mentions the Philistines and the Canaanites later on. It mentions them as origin of the Philistines. It also mentions Put, aka Libya, or Punt in East Africa. Canaan, Sidon, Heth, aka the Hittites, maybe even the Hittite Empire, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Gigashites, etc. And then Shem. They mention a whole bunch of other individuals, Aram, including Uz, Hul, Gesher, and Mash, Elam, Asher, aka the Assyrians, and all these different groups of people. So this is actually a recording of the languages of the ancient world, which is rather fascinating because linking people together based on languages is something we interpret as the behavior of modern day anthropologists. And yet this is actually something we see happen with the ancient Israelites. There's this understanding of, well, hey, all these people that speak a similar language might be descended from a common language and from a common ancestor. So what is the story of the Tower of Babel? This story is found in a passage of Genesis, and it's a legendary tale. Most biblical scholars, most clergymen do not regard this as a story that is to be taken literally. It is a legendary tale meant to illustrate human wickedness and explain the origin of languages. And so what is it? So it tells the story of human beings building a tower into the sky. And this story is meant to be a satire on Babylon. In fact, the word, we call it the Tower of Babel. But Babel actually comes from Bavel, the Hebrew name for Babylon. In fact, in other parts of the Bible, the Hebrew Bavel is directly translated as Babylon for modern readers, except in stories that biblical translators tend to regard as maybe not being as historical, in which case it's often rendered still as Babel or Bavel, which is what is done with this story. And it was meant not only as a pun on the Hebrew name for Babylon, but with the word Balil, meaning he confused. Because, see, the story in Bavel and Balil are very similar words. Especially in Hebrew, where they're basically only one consonant apart. So this was meant as kind of a word pun in ancient Hebrew. Because in the story of the Tower of Babel, what happens is human beings God intends for humanity to spread out across the earth following the flood. But humanity decides they don't wish to spread out. Instead, they wish to build a massive tower into the heavens. And so they start congregating, and God sees them building this massive tower in which to live in and reaching towards the heavens. And God's like, oh no, if they're already doing this, this is not good. They're already this defiant of me, and we're this early on after the flood. This is not a good sign. So I got to spread them out. So in the middle of the tower construction, God simply creates a confusion among all the people. Suddenly, they all begin speaking in different languages. So none of them is able to understand the other. And because none of them can understand the other, they are forced to spread out. They naturally spread out, separating from each other and their opposing languages, and thus humans spread all over the earth. And this was meant as a pun, because to the Hebrew reader, you'd be constantly reading Bavel and Balil, and it would be kind of a clever word pun. By complete accident, it happened that the word Babel, how we often render Bavel in English, because the same letter in Hebrew can be pronounced like a V or a B. So Bavel or Babel, is very similar to the English word babble, meaning to talk incoherently, right? B-A-B-E-L, Babel, is very similar to B-A-B-B-L-E, or babble. And so it inadvertently became a word pun in English. So that's fun. So what about Abraham? So we know that through the line from Shem, we get Abraham. So Abraham was living in the city of Ur in Canaan. Now, this is one of the first events we get in the book of Genesis that really starts to move into the realm of verifiable history. Because now we have a location. And with it being acknowledged it's the city of Ur, we also have a sort of time scale, because we know when the city of Ur was active and when the city of Ur fell. So this helps us to better date when about Abraham probably lived. And it's pretty clear it's around like circa 1850, 1900 BC or BCE. So that's a pretty good time period. Now, he's living there in the city of Ur, one of the major Sumerian city-states, and he is called by God. God calls him out to journey into the desert. And he tells and he's told by God his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the heavens. And he is granted at least two major sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Now, he has two children, one with his wife Sarah, which is his son Isaac, and one with his slave Hagar, who becomes it was Ishmael. And it's for this reason that Abraham is regarded as the father of actually not only multiple thousands of people, but also 3 world religions. Yes. How? Well, Isaac ultimately becomes one of the patriarchs and one of the fathers of the Jewish religion. And then from Judaism, following the coming of Christ, Christianity emerges. That's Judaism and Christianity. That's 2 religions. Ishmael, in the meantime, goes off into the Arabian Peninsula and has a kid who has a bunch of kids, on and on and on for several thousands of years. And it's believed that one of Ishmael's descendants is, in fact, Muhammad, the founder of Islam. So Abraham technically is considered the father of not one, not two, but three world religions, with the Jewish people, the Christian people, and the Muslim people all looking to Abraham as a spiritual ancestor, if not a literal biological one in many cases. And that is a pretty impressive resume. So his descendants are, not only his biological descendants, but his descendants in terms of the religions that he sprouted go all over the world. And it's also why these three religions are sometimes called the Abrahamic religions, right? In case you were curious why people call those three the Abrahamic religions, because all of those religions worship the same God that Abraham was talking to. And that's why they're called the Abrahamic religions. Now, some interesting events about Abraham's life. He forms a covenant with God in which he agrees to follow God and obey God's orders. And this covenant is formed using a traditional Israelite covenant ritual. And the way this is done is, in a traditional covenant ritual, the way people would do, like for a marriage covenant back in the day, was you would take a series of animals, right? Usually it would be an ox, goat, and then maybe like a bird or something. And you'd kill the animal, split the carcass in half, let the blood drain into a little ditch. And then traditionally, when people would make covenants, when they'd make agreements, they'd walk through the blood and would be like, hey, may this happen to me, that happen to me if I break the agreement. And this was seen as a form of making a binding legal agreement. God actually goes through that ritual with Abraham, God appearing in the form of a pod of fire that moves over this, this trench filled with blood as a symbol that he's making this agreement with Abraham. So let's talk about Isaac. So Isaac is one of the sons that Abraham has. And it's through Isaac that the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, the Jewish people come to be. And one of the things that's very interesting about Isaac is that Isaac almost ends up as a sacrifice. So some things to know. Abraham was very old. I mean, excessively old, like around 100 years old when his wife becomes pregnant with Isaac. So they're in their, she's at least in her 90s, if not 100 as well, when they wed. And I mean, not when they wed, when she gets pregnant. Now that's usually not medically possible. So this is regarded as a miracle from God. And when Isaac's a young boy, God calls out to Abraham and says, I want you to go up to this particular mountain. I want you to offer your son up as a sacrifice. And Abraham basically says, all right, sure, I'll do it. I trust you, God. And he goes up to the mountain and he ties his son up. He's got his son there. He's about to, you can see the illustration. He's about to stab him with the dagger. An angel comes out and says, no, don't do it. Don't kill your kid. God saw that you're willing to you're not willing to, you're even willing to give up your only son. All right, you're good to go. Don't kill him. Abraham instead finds a goat stuck in a thicket and offers the goat up instead. So what's up with this? This seems weird for a lot of us as modern people. There's a lot of this that makes modern Bible readers uneasy. I mean, you've got a lot of things. You've got parent being relatively okay with killing their own kid, and a description of a loving God asking his follower to kill his kid. That doesn't really sit well with most of us. So let's explain what's going on here. Well, there's a few explanations. The first one is that for us as Christians, we often see the story of Abraham and Isaac as symbolic of God the Father and Jesus, God the Son, right? In that just as how Abraham is prepared to offer up his own son Isaac as a sacrifice, and ultimately God tells him he doesn't have to do it, is often seen by many Christians as allegorical to how God the Father has himself, God the Son, Jesus, sacrificed, dies upon the cross for humanity, for humanity's sins. So the near sacrifice of Isaac is seen to prefigure the eventual death and subsequent resurrection of Jesus. Okay, that explains the significance that modern Christians take from the account, but does it have any other purposes? And the answer actually is yes. In ancient Israel, the main reason why this story was rather important concerns the idea of acting as a prohibition on infant sacrifice. It's important to understand that most ancient Israelites regarded Abraham as the ideal man. He was kind of seen as the example of a perfect follower of God. And so if Abraham did it, that meant it was A-okay. And if Abraham didn't do it, that meant it was sketchy. And this is pretty much why this story exists. There's an important symbolism to the fact that Abraham's about to kill his kid. God says, no, don't kill the kid. And Abraham sacrifices a goat instead. Many point to the fact that in Canaanite religion, the Canaanites were people that lived nearby the Israelites. The Canaanites regularly, in their cult to a false god named Baal, regularly practiced infant human sacrifice. And many believe that the account here was meant as a way of the biblical author indicating, no, God does not want infant sacrifice. God does not want you to kill your kid to try and appease him, right? That's why God told Abraham, no, don't do it. Don't kill your kid. And Abraham ultimately killed the goat, which is seen as an acceptable sacrifice. So it's a way of saying, hey, don't kill your kid, kill your goat. If that makes sense. Please note, that's not me endorsing you randomly killing goats. We as Christians don't really do sacrifices. As far as sacrifices go, the sacrifice of Jesus giving his life on the cross is sort of the ultimate sacrifice, and therefore we no longer are required to regularly sacrifice animals or things like that in old school sacrifices like that. So please do not turn off the computer and say Mr. Skanga told you it was okay to sacrifice goats willy-nilly. No, don't do that. All right, so that's going to end our discussion on the patriarch. We've gotten through creation, through the first part of the patriarchs. Next class, we're going to talk about patriarchs part 2 and maybe get into the Exodus. All right, I will see all of you through this medium again soon.